I'm going to start this video by pointing out something that I think should be obvious, and that is that regardless of the cause, as soon as someone crosses a line whereby they are targeting the public, engaging in vandalism or otherwise criminality, then they lose the right to be seen as a legitimate voice of contention. I think that should be obvious to any decent person. But instead, what we see is a lot of people who, because of the partisan biases, will defend extremists in their midst. Now, I think extremism takes several forms. I've tried very hard to be consistent in calling out extremism, regardless of the cause. Um, and for this, I've been accused of making false comparisons. Well, for the sake of record, I do not say that Just Stop Oil is the same as Patriotic Alternative. Clearly, there's differences in terms of the precise approaches that are used and the ideology and even the demographics of those involved. I absolutely recognize that. So I've never said that because I'm calling out all extremes, I'm saying they're all the same. Nevertheless, there is that common component whereby they are crossing a line and targeting the public. Now, whether it be a far right thug smashing an Asian business or an Asian home, or a Just Stop Oil activist not giving two hoots about messing with someone else's situation, messing with their day. In both cases, you have someone who think they have a right to hurt a stranger. That is true. That is a common component. Now, Just Stop Oil activists aren't racist. They're not. They're never going to terrorize a refugee, or they'll probably not even use a Molotov cocktail. But I still think they're extremists. I still think they're potentially dangerous. And so far, they haven't planted bombs or anything like that. But I wouldn't put it past them. They have used increasingly more extreme measures, that's elevated from spray painting buildings to sabotaging motorways. So I see people on the left kind of complain about, well, Just Stop Oil activists, or no, they'll say protesters have been sentenced to prison, which is appalling. You have the UN Human Rights Commissioner absurdly criticizing the United Kingdom for handing out those sentences. My point to the UN Human Rights Commissioner would be, in this world where we have torture, where we have dissidents murdered by police, where you have these very grave situations, to condemn the United Kingdom for simply upholding law and order, and standing up for the rights of the majority is absurd. It's an absurd analogy. It also raises a question about about this contention that the complaint around two-tier policing is somehow an invention of the far right. I think it's a very legitimate contention, actually. We've heard this hashtag two-tier care, and the response to that has been, well, those pushing it believe it, but on the other side, the left has said, oh, it's an invention of the far right, it doesn't exist, it's exaggerated. Yet the very same people would be complaining about the sentences handed out to Just Stop Oil, and they would say, "Oh, it's not fair. Why are they getting these sentences?" But racist thugs are, well, actually, they are getting sentences. But the irony is, they actually believe in a two-tier policing as well. They just, now that the right are saying it, they don't. I think the point I'm making here is, I think a lot of people believe in that. I think left and right, there's a lot of people who feel there is an inconsistency in policing, and that doesn't look good on the police. Now, I want to be clear here. I have huge sympathy for individual officers who have been working around the clock, have very little rest. They're probably exhausted. They've been personally attacked. There's been many officers injured. I do have a lot of sympathy for officers trying to contain the situation, and I think they have nipped it in the bud. I think the worst is over. That's the good news, along with the counter demonstrations. But the police don't come out of this squeaky clean either, because there is legitimate anger over how policing has been done. I mean, where you have a situation where police are seen taking the knee, which I think they've got no business doing, it's a political gesture, they shouldn't be doing that. And then there's been other situations where an England flag has appeared and they've immediately swooped in and arrested someone. You know, you can't deny that the optics of that do look inconsistent. Um, and yes, there have been some Muslims arrested in these protests as well. No, these riots, you know, they're not protests, they're riots. But I think it would be wrong to dismiss concerns about two-tier policing and claim it's somehow the domain of the far right. That's just a lazy argument because a lot of people have this concern, including many people on the left. So just because you get right-wing figures saying that doesn't mean it's illegitimate. I think it's wrong for Starmer to dismiss that and for the police themselves to dismiss it. I think one of the issues that is at play here is this perceived detachment from the establishment, whether it be the government or the mainstream media, which is not really a term I like to use, but I'll use it in this context, or the police. Now, I made a video talking about this anger and this detachment. That is so important because if all those institutions are failing to connect with people, if they're failing to take concerns seriously, then disillusioned people will gravitate to more extreme factions, which I think is a tragedy. I think it's awful, and you get whether it be Islamists or far right groups, they put their claws in the impressionable people, and it's sad to see, and it's obvious to see, unfortunately. Um, if you have something like Telegram, which is a Russian website, I think that this component can't be overlooked, actually. It hasn't really got as much attention as maybe it should have got. I would not at all be surprised if there's Russian influence going on here. Now, I don't think if someone goes out blind drunk in Sunderland or Hartlepool or Middlesbrough or Liverpool and, smashes a police station, Putin's told them to do that. I don't think it's like that. But I do think that Telegram, it's one example, is stoking up the disinformation that is definitely fueling anger. Where you get false narratives, for example, like the Southport attacker was a Syrian fella, according to ex-Olympic boxer in that area in Merseyside, who said that falsely. Um, or there was another incident in Norfolk where an elderly woman was attacked and Somali migrants were falsely blamed. I will say there is issues around transparency here. Maybe the time has come where police do need to be a lot more transparent. If they've arrested someone, for example, instead of people getting into conspiracy theories online and jumping to conclusions, if the police just establish the facts publicly, i.e., we have arrested this person, this is their background, then it will stop that rumor mill. The problem with saying nothing and saying we cannot release the details is it then creates this vacuum where people will fill in those details. Now, I understand sometimes there is legal reasons for that because of due process, but surely when someone has been arrested, um, identifying them isn't the same as saying they are guilty. I don't really think naming the demographic is damaging due process because a jury would look at that based on the evidence that's available. So, for example, in the Norfolk incident, when Somali migrants were falsely blamed, what the police should have done is that actually it was whatever the demographic of the arrested party was. That would have then shut up the false rumours. I mean, maybe some would argue, oh, well, no, Nathan, actually it wouldn't because they'd still spread lies. Maybe so, but at least it would take away some of that oxygen. So I do think it's very, very important for transparency within reason. I'm not talking about um, to the point where it would really, really damage due process. But I don't think it would. I don't really go along with this idea that more transparency destroys. I mean, it's like the argument of um, having transparency in other cases where someone's name. I mean, I suppose you could argue. I suppose we need to look at this from every angle. If someone is named as a suspect before they've even been found guilty in a court of law, then it damages that. But it damages the due process. But I'm just what I'm considering here is the fact that if someone is not named, then the rumor mill churns up, and I just think that if there was more transparency, it would weaken that. That's all I'm thinking about. Um, anyway, what I want to look at a bit more here is some of the deflection and downplaying that's been going on. I've criticised the left for their attitude to Just Stop Oil. I think there's too many people on the left that continue to talk about them as peaceful protesters. No, they're criminals. They put lives at risk, incidentally, with what they do on motorways, not only their own lives, but the lives of the emergency services. And, when they're climbing scaffolding, it's not just a simple thing to bring them down. It's a complex procedure, and I think that the I'm a little bit disgusted by the way certain left wing celebrities kind of go out of their way to defend them, showing an absolute disregard for the ordinary people whom they are impacting. Now, in a similar way, I feel angry when conservatives who should know better, I'm talking about intelligent, otherwise decent people, who say, well, I don't support the rioting, but people are fed up after years of mass immigration, as if that somehow justifies it. I mean, you are either against rioting or you're not. You can't say, oh, I'm against it, but, because that but basically goes on to serve as an excuse. Um, I think it's legitimate to say, there's no excuse for this, but the government does have to address anger in order to, take away influence from those far right groups. But I've seen conservatives try to claim that there's a very small far right component that barely exists. That's delusional. It's utterly delusional. Clearly, there's some very dangerous groups out there, like Patriotic Alternative, who are basically neo Nazis. Um, and there's others. And you have to be living on another planet if you cannot see what's going on with that. I see denying that problem as no better than Muslims saying there's no problem with Islamism. It's got nothing to do with Islam. When you get a jihadist suicide bomber who kills 20 young people in a concert hall in Manchester, and then they want to pretend that Islamic extremism isn't a thing. Um, I think, again, you get a situation. Well, what they'll do is they'll condemn terrorism. They'll say, oh, we stand with the victims, we condemn it. But by the way, it's nothing to do with Islam. I think that's unhelpful. I think they need to recognize it may not be their version of Islam, but it is nevertheless Islamist extremism. Um, I find this depressing that when we see extremes in the midst, there's partisan people who will not acknowledge it. And in a way, they're worse than the extremists themselves. If we get into actual figures, the actual hardcore people who will, scale a bridge for Just Stop Oil, or smash an Asian family's home, or planned suicide attacks in Britain, we're probably talking a hardcore of at most a couple of thousand people across the country, out of 68 million people. What's concerning, though, is there'll be many, many, many more people who will defend these groups. Now, am I saying that a Just Stop Oil activist is the same as a racist fuck? No, I'm not saying that. And I've been accused of making what people would argue is a false analogy. I'm not saying it's the same thing. But I am saying that in both cases, you have crossing the line. You have a deliberate targeting of the public. You have a deliberate contempt for the law. I mean, that's undeniable. And in both cases, you have zealots who are convinced that they're right. The racist rioter believes their country's being overtaken, so that justifies them putting a brick through glass pane. And the eco zealot believes the planet's dying, so that justifies messing with the rest of us. Um, it's extremism. I mean, if I was to define extremism, I would say when someone believes their ideology gives them a green light to do as they please, I would say that probably defines extremism. Now, a reasonable person will always have checks and balances on themselves. They will say, yes, I feel angry about this, but I can't go out and do that. I mean, I often feel disgusted at some of the leniency that goes on in our criminal justice system, but I'm not going to go out and burn someone's car. And if I was to go to a court of law and interrupt proceedings, all I'd be doing is giving the victim a longer wait for justice. It wouldn't help anyone. But I do mean saying that, where these sentences are welcome, that isn't enough. The government does have to take anger seriously. I'm not saying pander to extremists for a second, but this didn't just come out of nothing. There is legitimate concerns over small boats. There is legitimate concerns over issues like grooming gangs. And I think for too often there's been a sense that we better not talk about those things because it's politically incorrect. The problem with avoiding issues is who's going to take that up? It's going to be extremes. It's going to be people who are willing to spread false information and distort that so that they can be galvanized. In terms of the sentencing, there will be people who say, well, wait a second, the prisons were overcrowded. How come the government's found 500 new places? I have no problem with the tough sentencing. And I actually think it's important that the government gets control and sends out a tough message. Otherwise, anarchy rules. Nevertheless, it's valid to ask, well, yeah, where are these places coming from? Now, I have no problem with it. I think someone who incites violence blatantly um, deserves to face justice. This has even included a Tory councillor's wife. I don't accept this idea. Oh, I was angry over three little innocent girls being killed in Southport, so I sent a message online for people to go and burn down a hotel with migrants in it. Not only is that inciting mass murder of the migrants, it's inciting violence against, the hotel staff as well. That should be treated seriously because in this context, when there is violence on the streets, that isn't just words. I'm not saying it should get the same sentence as actual violence, but I don't think it's harmless at all. And if it's delusional, if people think that's harmless, delusional. Right, I'm going to wrap this up. My throat's going a little bit here, but I feel frustrated at people who are so blinkered by their partisan allegiances that they'll turn a blind eye to the extremes in their midst because it happens to go along with their wider ideology. So there are conservatives who want to downplay the far right. They wouldn't necessarily agree with them directly, and I think they would genuinely find rioting distasteful. Nevertheless, they'll say, oh, well, it's kind of just, it's not as big as the left's making it out to be. But then you get people on the left who continue to call Just Stop Oil criminals peaceful protesters and totally disregard the misery that they have caused our ordinary people. You get Muslims who continue to deny the reality of Islamic extremism. In every case, there's a denialism at play of the obvious. I make no apology for calling out all these extremes, and I'm sure there's other examples. Um, Extremism isn't just holding a strong view on something, we all do that. It's when that ideology makes the individual think that they can therefore do as they please in pursuit of that ideology. In a civil society, we're all bound to the law. How policing is done is another matter, but the point is no one has a right to say, well, my ideology is correct. My anger is more justified than other people's anger, therefore I can go out and do what I want. That's what I find so astonishingly arrogant, particularly about Just Stop Oil. I mean, I don't care if they come from a respectable middle class background, they're retired doctors and teachers and so on. They think they have a right to break the law. They think they have a right to mess with people's lives. That makes them obnoxious and extreme in my view. And they've shown absolutely no remorse in a court of law for doing so. That's why they've got stiff sentences. They're not being punished because they care about the environment, which is the pathetic argument that their apologists use. No, they're punished because they're breaking the law. The same with racist thugs who are rioting, the same with others. So stop calling them protesters. When you cross a line, you're no longer a protester, you're an extremist.